Good morning, everybody. Before I hand things over to Allison and Brandon, I wanted to just quickly do an overview of the schedule. For those of you who are in 511, at 10:15, we will meet in room 501 for you all to get kind of set up with printing and technology. We will have workshop at 11. Those of you in the cross-genre workshop, we're just going to be meeting on the ground floor in the commons and, near the historic hallway. And Bradshaw and I will take you up to the print studio. And then in terms of materials and methods, same thing. If you're in 511 and you're going to do materials and methods in person, we're going to meet you in the commons area and take you up to the book art studio, which is near the print shop, but it's still a separate space. So, and then of course we have a reading this evening, Brandon Shimoda and Sarah Jaffe. Super excited about that. Just to let everybody know, we have two. I love how there's a room arrangement going on in room 601. So you can see everybody. We're in two different rooms, and then we have all of these Zoom channels going. I love it. I just feel so fortunate to be in community with you all. And on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Brandon Shimoda and Alison C. Rollins. Let's give them a hand.
Thank you, Jay. Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Hi, Allison.
Hi, Brandon.
I'm in Colorado.
Now I'm in Chicago, another city with a C.
Yep. So we have a lot of things to talk about. I think the thing that we are thinking about talking about, although we'll see how it goes, is echo. We had already been talking about, I think, the work that we're both currently engaged in. So Alison has been sharing with me the Red Curator, the project that she's been working on, which she read from last night. And then in response, I've been sharing with Alison an essay that I've been working on that's actually due next week. So we thought, why don't we just open up the conversation that we've already started to have to this kind of public space. So I think we have questions for each other, but we're also just going to talk about not only our work in progress, but the idea of a work in progress and the difference maybe between what it means to be engaged in a work versus for a work to be completed. I don't know if that's even something that's real, but we're going to talk about these things. And I actually thought we could start, Alison, because you read from the Red Curator last night. Do you mind if I just start asking you questions?
Sure. Okay, yeah. And then you could talk a little bit about your project that you
Yeah. So maybe you can tell us which phase of this project you're currently in, although maybe without it being complete or nearing completion, it's difficult to measure where that phase is. But thinking about how you shared a work in progress with us last night, not only did you read it, but you invited two other people to read it with you. So you had the experience of hearing your own voice, processing out loud the work, but also the voices of two other people. So I'm curious just to start in thinking about how was that experience? What was it like to read it last night? What kind of came out of that? for you?
Yeah, so I guess if we were to make a scale of 0 to 10, and I think there's still numbers in the negative and numbers that exceed 10, but for the sake of using language 0 to 10, I'd say the manuscript I feel like is at the level of 3 right now. And that is because it's a manuscript that every day calls to me. I've found it really liberating to have these two voices of the curator and the artist with me, and they communicate things to me, they tell me things, and they do so in a way that I can very quickly document what they're saying rather than have to get caught up in kind of character development or making them do things, which maybe is part of the necessity in writing narrative or different types of prose. So I can very quickly and easily be in communication with them constantly, for better or worse. And to that end, I'm really been troubling a lot my own notions of authority and knowledge, like as an educator and as now also a formal student, like what I'm supposed to know or how I'm supposed to be able to help mentees in their own writing and practice. I feel like as I learn more or gain more education and credentials and degrees, I actually know less. So it's a way of kind of trying to unpack that dynamic of like trying to provide students with encouragement or answers or resources, but also simultaneously feeling like I don't know much or my knowledge is constantly unraveling rather than accumulating. And so part of the fun of this manuscript has been letting other people read it, because I immediately have to face like, that's not how I would have the artist sound, or that's not the tone I was going for, or like that affect wasn't what I thought in that moment, or my partner yesterday was laughing at certain points, so it was like, okay, that's good, I want that to be funny, but how darkly funny is it? Or so it's been fun to try out and experiment while writing and revising the process of what it means to have readers who will do whatever they want with the work. They're not, I don't need to be the one dictating how the work should be or is received. It's pretty much out on its own to explore and play past publication. So it's been fun to hear the voices be held in other people's mouths and throats and bodies outside of my own. And especially because in the pandemic, we don't do live readings where you can hear audience like sighs or responses or noises. So it's been fun to try to replicate that a little bit and having people read aloud.
Yeah, were you getting that from, well, Nate was sitting right next to you. Were you getting some of that those audience noises when he was reading?
Yes, because I asked him multiple times to look at the script before reading, which he didn't really do. So it was a little bit new to him as well. So it was curious to see, like, as he was live reading, like, what are the moments where his inflection changed, or he seemed invigorated, or he thought it was funny. It was interesting to like track that.
Yeah. So thinking about last night, but also in general, when you give a reading, is there a relationship for you between giving a reading and revision? So for example, after last night, did you think, oh, I need to change this or do this?
Yeah, I feel like one of our colleagues, Alejandro, had mentioned at one of the residencies, perhaps thinking about readings as a type of publication of many. And so I do think of it as a type of like it was an event that I guess maybe was recorded, but it's over now. So it's out of date. So I'm not really wed to, that was a particular moment and experience that we had that in the moment was being revised. Because there were moments where Jay or Nate said things that weren't on the page, like little slippages or moments in which like words were skipped over. So it already had its own life outside of my musical score. But I'd like to think of that as a publication / revision, perhaps.
Yeah. That was a brilliant talk that Alejandro gave a year or more ago. So, all right. So in this is a project called the Red Curator. And last night we heard from primarily the curator, the artist, and then also you were the narrator, I guess. There's also the voice that provides that information and that narrative. But you were saying that every day these two figures call to you. So I'm wondering what that means when you're in the midst of a work. What does it mean when they're calling to you, and when did they start calling to you?
That's a good question. They're clearly figments of my imagination, but also not. I guess what I mean by that is like I have a professional website, I have a CV, I have a resume. So I've created a narrative about how I'm qualified to do certain things, or I have like a public facing persona. So those things, I guess I've earned or are true, but to me, they're also quite fabricated, or they're a type of make believe or construct. And so I've just chosen to name two figures, one being curator and one being artist, to use them as kind of funnels or vessels or portals to explore what I think those roles mean, have meant, and could mean. And so, yeah, I think I've started this project in relationship to going back to school because it actually helps me to maintain a type of peacefulness mentally and to not take myself too seriously. So I've created them out of my own necessity, or like for a functional purpose, in terms of where I am in my life right now. And so those roles could change or morph. What I call them, what I name them could change or morph, but that's what I'm using now as like containers.
Yeah. Is this also work that you're bringing into the MFA program there, or?
Sometimes I bring it into workshop and sometimes I don't, depending how foolish I would like to be. I'm really leaning into, I have a close friend and a fellow member of my cohort that's interested in the figure of the fool. And so I'm like really leaning with them into that notion, like of like, like not just what it means to not be serious for the work and for your process, I guess.
Yeah. Is that related to, well, so sometimes you introduce the work into this like peer group, and sometimes you maybe are more protective of it. Which is the more foolish?
Probably introducing into workshop.
Yeah, I thought so. Just wanted to check. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So, all right. So these two figures are calling to you, and at this point, because you've opened up the space of this in progress work, their calling to you is relatively constant. And it's a way for you to process and make peace with and find peace within, etc. How did it start? Like I mean, you mentioned that among the influences are Dion Brand's The Blue Clerk. And then also, you mentioned this last night at the reading, right? And the documentary film, The Price of Everything. Did these two influences kind of solidify those figures, or were these figures starting to happen prior to that?
I think, what do they say in improv? Like both and, or I'm not sure. I think I probably I know for a fact, I saw The Price of Everything before I read The Blue Clerk. But when you, Brandon, and Asia gave your talk on The Blue Clerk, I re-entered that text again, like again, to borrow Alejandro's language from his reading yesterday, like there's writings, or there's no such thing as rereading.
Oh, right.
Content. So I think I've read, in theory, The Blue Clerk circa 2019 or something, but I continue to reread it in relationship to talking about it with students or hearing you and Asia talk about it. And so it's also a very generous text in that it just keeps giving. Like that's one particular book I think about in terms of it never runs out. Like it's a fountain. And so you will never uncover what it means to read it.
Yeah. Yeah. So to quote Alejandro from last night, that's funny. It's it's one of the things I wrote down. The word rereading should be forbidden. We have never already read a text. Sorry to slightly botch that, Alejandro, but
yeah.
So Yeah. Thinking about the Blue Clerk and thinking about the Red Curator, and I don't know if this is an ideal or an aspiration, but to create or arrive at a project that you can coexist with, and that everything that you're experiencing, or a great deal of what you're experiencing, processing, thinking about, encountering, can go into that project, right? It seems like the Red Curator maybe is a version of that. Like you've created a form or a space or a dynamic where you can actually process your life in real time, which not, obviously not every work is like that, right? Some are more ephemeral, or some have other concerns, or whatever it might be. Does that resonate? Is that what's happening with this?
Yeah, I think so. I think one text, I think it's by Elizabeth Scanlon. It's called Her 37th Year
Oh
in
yeah,
Yeah, so
yeah.
I've been interested for some time in texts that function as like catalogs or glossaries or indexes, or have some type of like numeric ordering system. And then in addition to that, I had encountered this past semester John Keane's Annotations,
Mm,
which is considered an experimental novel. Of the back of the cover says like poem like compression, which is really autobiographical but highly referential and arguably scholarly. And so I was thinking also about how much I like bibliographies, or like I'd love to do a reading just of a bibliography, even though I don't think that would be perhaps exciting for listeners. But what it means to try to unpack the references and the research of a process in a way that's hopefully fun and satisfying for readers, but also speaks to um, sometimes how like interwoven the piece actually is, and how like multivocal it is. Like I don't think ever when I'm writing it's just me. Like it's just me in solitude processing absence from community with others from the past,
mm,
present, future, etc. So at least if I cite things that suggest visually that there are other voices here, or if I have a character in a colon, like in a play, someone else is speaking, it's not just me, or I'm not in control of the text. Like that's what I love about plays, because each actor can interpret um, the text, or if you're putting together a musical composition or a rendition of music, you are interpreting what is the standardized set text. So this is the first time I think I've written with like a character colon saying something,
mhm,
as a method of trying to get closer to like how Jay's tone might be differs from maybe how your tone would be, Brandon, if you read it, or like even the vocal quality of voice and sound, how it sits differently in different minds and mouths depending on the person.
mhm. Yeah, by the way, when I was listening to Jay and Nate last night at a certain point, and I think that let me try to organize my thoughts here. I think there's something really important about like the durational aspect of this project. Obviously, there's more to come, but that's why I asked you before we got on, why did you stop? Right?
Hmm.
Um, I don't know if people remembered last night. Alison stopped before the end of the piece that you had prepared to read, and I think that one thing I really am responding to, and it was kind of clarified in listening to it last night, is that it's really a work that gains a certain kind of momentum and energy from being inhabited over a longer period of time. Because at a certain point, listening to Jay and Nate, I felt like I was listening to like a narration from the afterlife. And I don't know if there was something kind of like echoing. There was like an echo coming through my computer. But it felt like at some point a posthumous. There was like a posthumousness to the dialogue, which I found really interesting. And I don't know if it had to do with their voices or what that had to do with. I'm curious. I hope you don't mind if I just keep asking you questions.
Yeah, no. If I could interject
Yeah,
briefly for you said it was gaining momentum from being inhabited over a longer period of time.
Yeah.
So I don't know that that was my conscious intention, but I am trying to trouble the notion that the artist and curator are living inside of a wolf together.
Right.
They're inhabiting that space. And so that's curious for me in terms of they're sharing this space for an extended period of time, unknown, and what momentum that could suggest, even if you're being stagnant or in place, if that makes sense. And then your comment, narration from afterlife and posthumous. I'm really, I had read this semester the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubras, which is a
Oh
text in
yeah.
Portuguese by Machado de Assis. And it's also like actually kind of serialized novel. And I absolutely fell in love with it. Like the foreword, it's like dedicated to the worm that's eating the primary character's body. So it's like collaborating with this worm that's actually cannibalizing our speaker in the novel. And I really like this notion of like what constitutes the afterlife, or like how do we, am I writing to you from the living, like as a living being? Am I writing to you like certain parts of me have died in order for me to evolve, or certain parts of, like, I don't know how to mark life and death in a non-linear way, like how, or like the writing when it's published also kind of dies for me, but then it lives, like it's reborn in each reader, it's reborn each time people read it or share it or I read, like, so it's like these little miniature deaths and rebirths continuously, or I don't know, like there's certain like emails I've sent that I would like to not be circulated maybe till after I die physically, but like I don't like this, the notion of like secrets or things that are private or like better suited for death or like posthumous publication has always been like fascinating to me, as perhaps an aside.
Yeah, it's, well, so thinking about how, again, you are in the midst of creating a space that you can inhabit in real time and process experience in real time, and how that might also relate to the consequence of that creating like a voice from the afterlife, narration of the afterlife. So it's very, you're very, like, the more present you are, the more maybe timeless that voice becomes. And maybe timelessness, I'm using timelessness as synonymous with posthumousness. If that makes any sense, like this relationship between presence and then what happens to like the product of that presence. In a way, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know how to finish that thought, but yeah, it's really interesting. The non-linear relationship to living and dying seems to make a lot of sense. It seems to make a lot of sense in terms of the creative process, and also like the ways in which you're receiving ideas and information, and the ways you're dealing with intuition and so on. So I just want to mention something that you have done for people in your life, which I want to bring back to your creative process. But you put together these things called wonder boxes. I don't know how long you've been doing this or how often you've been doing this, but the one that you gave to me a couple of years ago, it's basically a plastic VHS, a VHS tape, but just the case. And you filled it with, I would say, hundreds of pieces of material, objects, elements, clippings from magazines, fortunes, all kinds of things. Cassette, I think there was a cassette tape in there, maybe. And I've since given it to my child, who, I mean, not that I didn't know what to do with it, but she knows what to do with it. And in a way, she's taken all those materials and has been inventing her own narratives out of the things that you put together, and finding all these really wonderful, surprising connections in the things. And, as I'm spending time with this and watching her spend time with this, and then spending time with your work.
Mm.
I'm wondering, is the wonder box kind of part of the ritual practice of your creative process? Like whether it's an actual wonder box or whether that's what you do every time you make something. You have to gather these materials and surround yourself with them, even if they don't actually enter into the work itself.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking about gather materials because in that sense, I sent you a multiple physical objects, so those are materials. Um, and I'm still really, I'll continue to like marinate in Sarah and Pupe's talk yesterday also, because I think about those materials maybe in terms of also being details.
Mm.
So when I've collected all of them, how do I possibly like cull them or organize them or display them or make them legible or illegible? How do I organize? Like, I think maybe what I'm like, I am, when we write, maybe we are curating, like, we're organizing information, if you will, in a particular way and format. So it is an act of, I guess segregation is like too loaded a term, perhaps, but it is an act of selection,
Mhm.
choice, if you will.
Yeah.
And so, but even like when we go to museums, to like your disbelief is sort of suspended, or the power dynamic is sort of suspended because you just immerse yourself in the exhibition. You're not thinking about like, who designed this? Why did they design it? How did they design it? What constraints are surrounding? What's the context for the you're just kind of intaking the exhibition. And we trust often museums, libraries, places like that as like being invested in the public good, or they're just showing us things for us to learn for our benefit. Like we often don't really critically interrogate, or we're meant to just be there for enjoyment and education, entertainment. And so I'm thinking about like how to expose or show the underbelly, or like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, as it relates to curation and writing and exhibiting things. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Speaking of the Wizard of Oz and behind behind the curtain, if this feels like a really Barbara Walters kind of question. But
Love
if what about Barbara Walters?
I think I like Barbara.
Oh, really? Yeah,
I think.
I don't know if I have an opinion, but I know that like back in the day when she was interviewing people, she would ask questions like, if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? I think she asked that I remember her asking that of Katharine Hepburn.
Nice.
Um, so please excuse the Barbara Walters question, but if we were to pull the curtain back on the Red Curator or on your creative process, what would we see?
I think a lot of notes, and perhaps we could use this to segue into like your process. Like, I'm taking notes, and I use the term notes very loosely because notes could be observations. Notes could be like in any format, I guess, if you will. So maybe it's maybe it's receipt. I don't know. Yeah, notes very, very loosely and for lack of like better language.
Yeah.
But it's like a pile and collection of notes.
Yeah. Like physical notes?
Some are physical, some are not.
Those that are not are what? Thoughts?
A note could be like a scent. Um, a note could be a feeling that's held in the body, that's actually maybe it doesn't have the ability to be articulated using language. So in that sense, it is like ephemeral and bodily. I think those would just be two examples. Like also living matter, like I don't live in Colorado anymore, but there's particular trees in Colorado that I developed a relationship with and would actually interview and talk to. And so I haven't seen them in a while, but I do think I carry their matter with me. even though I didn't like take a piece of the bark or a leaf or like something physical, or tangible, if you will.
Yeah. Is that something that is like an inspiration that you carry with you, or a companion, or maybe something that even enters into what you write? Like that, like a scent, for example, or a relationship with a tree. Like where does that go? How do you carry that?
That's a really good question, because I'm not sure how exactly I carry it, and B, it's the librarian in me. It's like there's always also not enough space. Like the implication that I could carry everything or all the things is not possible. So I'm hemorrhaging things all the time, like
Hmm.
consciously or unconsciously. So um, I'm also losing things as I'm gaining, so I don't quite know.
Yeah.
It's another preoccupation I have, is like there's not enough space. So uh, some things must fall away.
Yeah. There's not enough space in your head or in your life.
All of the above. Yeah.
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 Um, do you, I'll skip that question. I wanted to return to something you said about when a piece is finished. You said something like, when a piece is finished, if it's published, etc., you die to the reader. Is that what you said? Like you have to die, or some part of you has died, or the work has died. Do you remember what you said?
Yeah. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I think what I'm trying to express is when I publish something, I have given it away in a sense. It's no longer mine, if you will, which feels clunky, but I've released it to be. I don't know. I'm somehow not in control anymore, or if I ever was in control, I wasn't really to begin with, but I'm less in control than when it's in my possession, if you will.
Right.
I think that's.
Yeah, and I asked that, I mean, responding to what you had said earlier and just now, I asked that partly because I've been feeling maybe more and more recently, um, like I just want to stay in the work in progress.
Mm,
That I because there have I had enough at this point, I've had enough experiences with work that has been completed
hmm,
and is no longer mine, which there's plenty of wonderful things about that, but um that I feel either abandoned or that I am abandoning, but ultimately I feel each time a deepening of my loneliness
mm,
in relation to what I'm doing. And it's almost like I have to create a new work in order to find myself again. And
wow.
then if I get there, or if I get close to there, then it's like, well, I don't want to let this go.
Hmm,
Otherwise, I'm just like sloughing off parts of me until there's nothing left. Um,
yeah.
so thinking about being in the Red Curator right now, and maybe it's too soon to say, um, but do you feel like this is also providing you something that when it's, I mean, again, too soon to say, but providing you something that when it's over, um, I don't know how to really formulate the question, but I guess it's just basically what I was saying about myself, projecting that onto you, maybe.
No, I mean, before you made those series of comments, I literally wrote relationship to loneliness. I don't think that you had used the term lonely before, but I do think that your desire to stay in the work while it's in progress is could be summed as like a type of arriving. Like I want to always be in progress or arriving.
Mm.
At the moment I've arrived, if that is to be publication, then the momentum stops perhaps, like, or it's like the experience is over. And so there is a type of sadness and grief. I don't know also how to describe, but there is an intense loneliness. Even when I'm writing collaboratively or in community with other, like, I don't know if that loneliness is essential to what it means to write. But there is a type of loneliness that seems to be inescapable in process. And I was curious, I read your piece I think you're going to read from tonight, and this could be an interesting segue because I wrote down some sentences that you have from it. You said, I am not always sure that I am where I think I am. Or I am drawn especially to sites in which no trace of the past remains. And so there seemed to be this dislocation that the piece is experimenting with, or like a lack of certainty. Like, how do you know, or how are you aware of the work being in progress? Because you have a deadline, like you have an actual, I think, point in which you need to turn this in for perhaps something in return, perhaps money, some coins, or publication. But like, how do you know when the arrival needs to take place or will take place?
Yeah, so just to give context, and I'm gonna put it in the chat. People should feel absolutely no obligation to look at it, but this is what we're talking about. Let's see. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's two things. I've been writing a book for a while now about Japanese American incarceration. And in a way, I mean, it's coming out in 2024, but in a way I feel more comfortable saying that it's something I'm working on, as opposed to something that's like forthcoming or that has already been published. Mm-hmm. Because I'm really kind of, not that I have no ideas beyond this particular book, but I don't believe that I can escape it, or I don't want to escape it, because as I said, if I'm not working on it, then I'm not doing anything. So I was invited to, there's a writer who I revere, Karen Tay Yamashita. She has a book coming out from Coffee House, and it's a book of short stories, but she invited 8 writers to contribute their own pieces to her book. And each piece has to be in some way about an unmarked grave somewhere in America. Mm-hmm. Something where something has happened and has been more or less sort of erased from the historical record, but a physical place. The deadline is next week. Mm-hmm. I have to turn in an essay next week, and I'm using this essay to also as a chapter in the book that I'm working on. The deadline feels menacing. Mm. And it's not that I'm afraid that I'm not going to get it done, because I will, mm-hmm. but it feels like let's see, how can I explain this better? The essay is about a school in San Francisco, a big brick building that's preschool through 8th grade, that very much like PNCA was formerly used as an immigration detention facility. Mm-hmm. And I visited this school, and I talked to the people who worked there, and they had no idea. And then I felt very ashamed that I was bringing this history into the place where these people were working. Mm-hmm. The facility was used to detain primarily Asian immigrants, primarily Chinese immigrants. The school now is a school for Chinese American students. Mm. So there's that. historical and contemporary relationship, but yet there's no awareness of that connection. In the process of just spending time in this building and then researching it, I discovered that there was a woman, a mother, who killed herself while detained in this building. And so the essay has become kind of this attempt to acknowledge her existence and pay tribute to it, and also talk about all the other things I just mentioned. I don't want to finish it, because I know that when I do, I won't have the opportunity, or I won't be creating the space to spend time with the immigrants, and in particular with this woman. I will have to go out of my way to reconnect with her memory. I don't know why it's important that I maintain this relationship, but it certainly has something to do with the reason why I'm writing it. But I've done this enough times to know that once it's done, it's like we will be pulled away from each other. So I'm trying to figure that out, because I also have to turn something in, and yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think part of being in the midst of it is I don't really know, but I kind of like the way that the curator and the artist call to you. It's not that this woman, her name is Ham Wang Shi, it's not that she calls to me, but this space and this memory and this historical situation continuously calls to me, especially the Japanese American and Japanese immigrants who were also detained there. Something is calling to me. But that's kind of like the bittersweet contract that we make with a work, is that we know we want to get it right, we want to get something right, and we want to arrive at like this imagined destination, but we know that when that happens, there will be separation. And that doesn't feel great. I just saw a question from Jason that says, why not become a grocer and never finish work? A grocer? Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I'll agree. I'll ask this question first, and then I feel like I could connect. I'm curious, in Jace, like coffee, artisanal coffee beverages, and what grocers do. I feel like there's a way I could, but you said you felt ashamed because it felt like you were carrying or bringing the baggage, the violent history of the past into a space where, especially in American culture, we have this notion like children are innocent, children are the future, like you're bringing that baggage and history into the space. Could you speak more about the feeling or register of shame? How was that a momentary experience? And I think you document or note it in the essay that then was fleeting, or
I guess it's more recurring than fleet. I mean, I guess some part of it was fleeting, but yeah, I went in, and I've done this in many places. What's the word for that? What's the word for the person who like is constantly dredging up the history that people don't want to face, in particular in the place where they live? Is there a word for that? There must be a word for that. Maybe in Russian there's a word for that.
And the word that one would choose is also dependent on context, right? Or position, like whether you're an instigator or you're there to like engage in a memorial. So like the tone is shifting depending on perspective, I think.
Yeah. Harbinger. Yeah, I don't know. I'm constantly, for my writing, I mean, to like bring it back to my writing, I'm constantly putting myself in situations that make me ashamed. Ashamed for like the way I conduct research, ashamed for maybe darkening the otherwise like happy mood of a particular environment. But I always try to do it in a friendly way. You know, I'm not like, I try not to walk into a space in shadowed, you know, I try to like be friendly about it. But I mean, I think especially in relation to this, to this history within my own community, you know, thinking about all of the different incarceration sites in which Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans were detained, and being a descendant of that, and that shame is part of that descendancy. And that so growing up and being indoctrinated with the idea that to talk about these things is inherently shameful, or is to expose the shame that people are trying not to express, is part of it. So I think that there's a way that like I've cultivated a research practice that makes me really uncomfortable, and maybe doesn't make the other people as uncomfortable as it makes me, because people have their own relationship to things and they're not as invested in obviously things as other people. But you know, I find it really interesting, you know, doing research on this school and how it's an evangelical Baptist school for young Chinese American students. And the school is sort of breeding within them the idea that like American citizenship is the apotheosis of being. And that certainly the casualty of that is difficult history, even and maybe especially if it pertains to your own ancestors. Like you have to bury and keep buried your ancestors in order to feel content being a citizen of this, you know, this country. And this school is like in that sense an assimilation factory, in the same way that I sort of understand the concentration camps and the detention centers to be assimilation factories. That's sort of moving far afield from the idea of shame, but I feel like in the kind of research that I do, the emotional responses that I feel are part of it. Like that's part of the research. You know, it's just, I don't want to make too many like far-fetched connections, but thinking about maybe sort of playing off the idea of the minor detail that we were talking about yesterday. And not only is it like the fly shit on the painting, but it's also all of the like shifts in emotional and physical response that we undergo when we're in a certain space. So that shame or that embarrassment becomes almost like a document. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I added to the chat, you said a research practice of discomfort. And I'd like to think about that more. Like the willingness to lean into discomfort. And also I hope if that discomfort is heavy on Brandon as writer, what are the ways that you alleviate or counteract, or how much discomfort can you hold? Like it's also speaking then to your tolerance levels or your resilience or your strength. And how do you mitigate or manage, can you only do so many research projects per year, per day? You have obligations as a father. Like how much research can one do?
So Nate was having a conversation with my partner, Lisa, and he was saying to her about me, he's all about the image. And I think actually my method of self-care within a writing project is to kind of revert to the origins of my love with poetry, which was like an attempt to describe the creek near the house where I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm writing an essay where I'm dealing with a lot of heavy shit and feeling complex emotions, but also writing about suicide and family separation, because this woman, Ham Wang-shi, she actually had lived in the United States before, but she re-arrived with her two youngest sons, and they were separated immediately, and she never saw them again, even though they were in the same building.
Mm-hmm.
So, difficult things is I turn my head slightly and I just look at something. So in the case of this building, I'm looking at the drawings made by children that are hanging up in the hallway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then just kind of going into those, or I go back out into the parking lot and there's children lining up after recess. And I guess that's my way of sort of mitigating the discomfort, is just by looking at things almost absent-mindedly, but absent-mindedness as like a really active pursuit. And then it's like the poet returns and consoles the researcher or consoles the nonfiction writer, and can kind of return to that creek. And it's like, oh, okay, I can just stare at the creek. But what happens is inevitably the creek or the image returns me to what is difficult. Because everything I look at reminds me of something that's difficult. There's like a momentary rainbow, but then the rainbow always ends in like, a pile of cow shit or something,
I mean, in the way that you just formulated language in your last articulation, you actually created figures, right? The poet directs your eyes towards the rainbow, and then this other figure, the researcher, shows up and turns you around towards the cow shit, or like repositions you towards. So it's like you have also these two figures, the poet and the researcher, and perhaps they are functioning differently in terms of your orientation and what they want you to see and how they console or kind of trigger, and that's what I mean. Like if you were to give those two figures voices and think about how they're communicating to you, what they're having you do, how they're impacting you in your process, like what would that look like?
Oh yeah. You mean if it was more like the Red Curator?
Yeah, like if you get like the researcher had a voice.
Well, it's funny because listening to I think the moments last night where I laughed was when I found really funny but like satisfying the conflict between the curator and the artist, also as embodied by Nate and Jay, and sort of like imagining that conversation between the two of them, but also thinking that these are people that are inside of you as well, and those moments that were almost like, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, or like absurd. It was like absurdist. There are moments in the Red Curator that are really funny, and they're funny because they're these like warring entities that are the same person. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. I don't know what that would look like if I were to like create those figures. I imagine that it would be, just because now I'm under your influence,
Love that.
I imagine that there would be a lot of like twins sharing like a bunk bed, and just just like love, and you stink and like, get the fuck away from me. I need you. Tell me what to do. I don't want to do that. Leave me alone. Like, wash my hair.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
Yeah, I get
beautiful.
that. Yeah. I mean, I love the language of being under the influence. Like I think that's I love for your life to be under my influence, but I like you phrase warring warring entities as being funny. And that's also why I'm interested in the function of comedy because if those warring entities are funny or there's something satisfying about the absurd, I'm curious about like how we make space for both of those figures with how do I say making room to listen to and to be in community with those two, if it is to be a binary, like these two warring entities, and to make it comedic, if that's both satisfying for like writer and reader, if you will, to find the comedy in the tension.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you're writing this, you're not, are you seeking out the comedy, or is the comedy something that just happens organically? Like, well, first of all, do you even think that any of what you've written is comedic?
Yes, because I think the act of writing, especially at this particular moment, is ridiculous. I have one of my good friends, Tarfia Faizullah. We talk and we have this game we play where we try to come up with like medieval concerns for living. So it's just like gingivitis or like eating bad venison. She calls it venison problems, or like in the midst of a pandemic and immense grief, we can't even really name to sit and process the grief would be it would just be never ending. How am I still making? Like, how do I have the bandwidth to make anything, to show up here on time and project myself on an internet connection to all of you? So it is kind of absurd and ridiculous at its core. So if I lean into that, or I just express freely how ridiculous it seems, then it somehow tips into being funny.
Yeah.
As opposed to that, just sorrow. Just sorrow.
Just sorrow, yeah. Well, it's hard to sit in sorrow 24/7.
Right.
You know, have you tried to do that before, or has that happened
sorrow, to you? Negative, no. Sit in silence is an activity that I find more approachable, but no, I don't think I have. Not willingly.
Yeah, not willingly. I do feel like like every depressive phase always yields to delirium. And then shit is funny and strange. If I'm depressed long enough, then I'm hungry and I'm tired, and like humor comes out of just being really exhausted.
Sure.
I just realized we only have 2 minutes, and we haven't invited anyone else to say anything, although a bunch of people have written things in the chat.
Yeah,
I mean, honestly, I feel like why I'm really grateful to be in conversation with you is because it feels like just it's not a work in progress, it's just in progress, and we say, all right, from 9 to 10, we'll just like pretend that 9 to 10 has any meaning whatsoever.
Yeah.
Because now I'm in your work, and now I'm thinking about it. It's already happening, it's like, and maybe this goes back to what you were saying about Alejandro's talk. There is eventually the Red Curator will be out in the world, but it already is out in the world. It's already being shared, and in a way, it's already being imagined and reimagined by people that are not you.
Sure, exactly.
So that's exciting that the work in progress is already a work that can be completed by somebody else, you know? Because now I have like several drafts that are printed out and sitting on my desk, and it's real, you know, it's real, and I'm happy about that.
Yeah, yeah. If I can share these doodles from this morning, I was going to try to tie it back to Jason's comment about a barista or a grocer. Um I got to be in conversation with a friend of mine earlier this semester who's a musician and a scholar, incredible artist named Jerome Ellis. He spells Jerome with 5 J's.
Mm.
And um, there was something I started to find. I spent a lot of time specifically in certain contexts, educational contexts at Brown University and at Harvard. And I found that a lot of PhD candidates would talk about their like research interests or what they were interested in terms of pillars. So they'd be like, my 3 pillars of my dissertation are these 3 things. Like, these are the 3 pillars that I'm looking on as it relates to this methodology or something. And so I always found that odd, but I was like, okay, that makes sense. That sounds formal and scholarly. And in this conversation with Jerome, he had mentioned gardening bok choy with his mother, and how they would cut the top leaves of the bok choy to eat, but they would leave the roots intact. They wouldn't dig up the entire plant. The roots would be intact. And he was talking about how if we just nurture the roots, even when they're dormant or not growing, not producing leaves, there's still the potential for an abundance and like a connectedness to the earth. So like even in the violence of cutting the leaves, there is still that underbelly, like the undergrowth, that is a rich and complex network system, even when there's nothing to show for it above. Mm-hmm. And so to Jason's comment about being a grocer, like I don't know that I can be really even a gardener or a grocer, but I've created this daily ritual of eating something raw every day. Eating something living in sort of a cannibalistic sense of like the living raw material is regenerative, and I see it as ritual in terms of my practice. So like so I made this like kind of crude drawing, but like the plant leaves are publications, right? Like our process, the things that we create and produce and share. And then the root system is what is maintained beneath the ground. So if I were to publish the Red Curator next year with New Directions Press or something, this would all disappear, arguably. Like I'd just be left with what's below. But if I view that root system as rich and like kind of everlasting and interconnected, like always connected to you, Brandon, always connected to all of the students in this program, always connected to Jay, always connected to Dion Brand, then it gives me like a type of peace, rather than seeing like my books as these pillars, these like static things. To me, this creates a more unsettling relationship because buildings can be toppled or fall over. They're not really interconnected to the earth. They're not like organic matter in that way. But if I view my products as plants, then they can be destroyed. I mean, we saw that even in the Shibli section that we talked about yesterday, Sarah and Pupe talked about yesterday. But the root system, like what exists beneath visibility, I would argue is maintained and has restorative power. And so I'm trying to lean more into that model of abundance from a root system, a plant, than the illusion of permanence and authority and stability that pillars or columns or like ornate structure, Oxford represents. And so that's how I would interpret in response, Jason, to your question of like grocer or barista, that I do feel my calling is to be an educator, to be a writer, and I do feel are my callings. But if I could interpret or extrapolate what it means to be a grocer, to offer people food and abundance in that form, that's one method I could think about that.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you for all of that, Alison.
Thank you so much, Brandon.
Is that
Let's
the end of
give
our
Brandon.
conversation?
Oh, it
That's
can
the
go
end of our
on.
conversation. Yeah, it'll go on.
Yes, we'll go on. I hope.
Let's give Brandon and Allison some vigorous applause. Thank you so much. That was so amazing. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Allison. See you in.
Workshop is at 11 o'clock, y'all. For those of the students who are in 511 right now, at 10:15, we're going to meet in 501 to do a little tech.